Welcome to Truth Be Found. Join us as we slip through the shadows and into the world of high-profile investigations with our host, professional investigator Justin Yentes, as he peels back the layers of the most perplexing cases, unmasking secrets to uncover the truth.
All right, well, today's guest is someone who's seen it all. Peter Forcelli, a former ATF Deputy Assistant Director, a former NYPD homicide detective. With over 1,200 arrests, Peter handled major cases like the Parkland High School and Pulse nightclub shooting, is a survivor of 9/11, and is nothing short of remarkable. From taking down criminal organizations to exposing the failures in the DOJ's Operation Fast and Furious, Peter's career has changed the course of investigations and the lives of those involved. So in March of this year, Peter's book was released, which is called The Deadly Path: How Operation Fast and Furious and Bad Lawyers Armed Mexican Drug Cartels, which coincidentally highlighted two of my cases, which we're going to talk about today. So Peter, I want to welcome you to Truth Be Found.
Honored to be here, Justin. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. And as I was going through your background and our history and our cases, I should say, there's honestly, there's just so much that we could get into today. And I had a hard time deciding where to start. So you and I first connected when a colleague of mine posted a link to your new book on LinkedIn. And honestly, whenever I can get a behind the scenes look from the government's perspective at one of our cases, I jump at the chance. And so I bought your book right away. And I'll say I loved it. And I've recommended it to, I don't know how many other people, especially being here in Phoenix, we're so involved with the Fast and Furious investigation. So well done on that.
Thank you.
I want to give our listeners some background of who you are, your history in law enforcement, and the role of the ATF with regards to gun running and gun trafficking here in Phoenix. So could you talk us through kind of how you got involved in law enforcement as a beat cop in New York, and tell us what it was like to kind of earn your bones on the streets of the Bronx?
Sure. I mean, look, I became a cop for the same reason a lot of other people became a cop. I watched a lot of TV as a kid. I saw Starsky and Hutch. I saw a lot of those shows, and I was lulled into this false belief that it was exciting and, constantly chasing down bad guys. And then your problems were solved in an hour. And then, but no,
Is that not the case? Is that not what you found?
No, it's not. In fact, there's a lot of cases that never get solved, unfortunately.
Right.
But so I walked the beat, like you pointed out, in the projects. I took the test back in the day when there were 3 different police departments in New York: the New York City Housing Authority Police, the Transit Authority Police, and the NYPD. We all took the same test, went through the same academy. I wanted to be an NYPD cop, but I got picked. It was just by happenstance. It wasn't like you put in for one or the other. I got picked for housing. And at first, I was actually very disappointed because I didn't know much about the housing police. It was much smaller. They didn't have the same equipment. They didn't have an emergency service unit, a harbor unit, a helicopter unit. Turned out to be a gift in disguise, though, because I walked the beat for years. You get to know people. You get to realize that the most important tool you have out there in the street is your mouth. It's like
Right.
how to relate to people. So I walked the beat for a while, a couple of years. Then eventually you earn your seat in the sector car when someone that had time on took a liking to you, and then someone else retired and moved on. So I spent some time in a sector car responding to 911 jobs. Not as rewarding because you're in and out. You're not dealing with the people as much. I know some folks might not agree with my sentiments on that.
Mm-hmm.
Some people liked being in the car better. Then I was asked to go into the plainclothes unit, which you're doing patrol work, but in civilian clothes. It was called the anti-crime unit at the time. And I was actually asked a couple of years later to go into the detective bureau, and I was somewhat young on the job. I had 8 years on the job. So I went in, say no to that, and then shortly after I became a detective, still in the housing police, Giuliani merged the 3 departments together.
Mm-hmm.
So I stayed in the detective bureau. I was a newer detective, worked in the 47th precinct, which was in the North Bronx. During that particular time, it led the city in homicide. So great way to learn.
Oh,
Saw
yeah.
a lot of things you don't want to see. And then I was asked if I would go into the homicide squad, and I did. And this was kind of during this weird time where New York started to finally acknowledge something that the cops all knew, but the city denied, was that they had a gang problem.
Mm-hmm.
So as a homicide detective, I worked homicides like everybody else did. But then they started this task force where they wanted to start prosecuting people federally because the Bronx court system was, I'll just say it plainly, was a joke. People
Hmm.
would go in, go to Rikers Island, plea bargain stuff down, meet other criminals from their neighborhood, come out with bigger and better connections. So it really made for really, I would honestly say, it just made the streets more violent, frankly, the way the system worked.
Wow.
So in that time, I started to work with ATF quite a bit, FBI, DEA. I even did one case with the State Department's Diplomatic Security Service on a passport fraud case.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, an interesting learning experience. And it was the ATF folks that I found had the biggest impact on the street level crime
Okay.
by going after people who were misusing guns, involved in robbery, shootings, and whatnot. And NYPD didn't pay very well back then. So
Hmm.
I decided I would try to take the test and move over to ATF. So about 5 years into my career as a homicide detective, a little bit less, maybe 4 years, um, I found out I passed the ATF test. And then at about the 5 year mark, I popped smoke and left. I retired. I was a very happy homicide detective. I just didn't like the lack of impact that we had.
Okay.
So I started as an ATF agent in New York. Spent 6 years there. Went to Phoenix as a supervisor, which is where we have some commonalities.
Right.
After I got thrown out of the state of Arizona, I went to headquarters for a short time. Then up to Canada for 2 years, where I was a liaison to law enforcement in Eastern Canada. Just amazing people, I have to say. Reminded me very much of the cops I started with back in the 80s.
Hmm.
Good cops. And then after 2 years up there, I was put in charge of leadership training for ATF as a result of some of the lessons learned in Phoenix.
Right.
And then went down to Miami, which, as you mentioned, Parkland and Pulse. I was originally the number 2 assistant special agent in charge down there,
Hmm.
then got promoted to the special agent in charge job. Um, After about 3 years in South Florida, came back to headquarters, and I wrapped up my career as a deputy assistant director, first over all operations in the eastern region of the United States, but then as the head of training, which was great because by that time I was ground down. So to
Right.
go down to the academy and see the fresh new faces, and it just helped me stay energized to some degree and
That
not
makes
get
sense.
completely jaded and pissed off.
Which I can imagine it would be easy to be jaded and pissed off, but going through what you had to go through in your career, and especially everything that happened here in Arizona, which we can talk about. And so, was it the mainly the impact that the ATF had on street crimes that drew you over to the federal agency, away from NYPD?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, some of the cases that we worked, we would go after somebody for like possession of a firearm if they were a convicted felon and had a bunch of
Hmm.
felonies under their belt. And we would arrest them for having that gun. And then what we would do is we would tell them, look, we're going to charge you with other, because we would go out and reinvestigate people. A lot of times, what the public doesn't realize is sometimes that arrest starts things. It's
Right.
not the end. So we would go out there and look at robberies they were done or homicides they might have been involved in, and we would start proving those cases.
Hmm.
And word gets out, man. Criminals talk to each other. So what happened is we called it proffering, and I'm sure you know what
Oh,
the
yeah.
proffer is. Civilian might not. Is that's when the defendant and their lawyer come and sit down with you and the prosecutor, and they talk about all the things they did because they want to work out a deal.
Hmm.
And in the federal system, instead of like the deal being okay, hey, thanks for coming, we'll plea bargain you down to a misdemeanor. There it was, all right. Well, you can get a reduction in sentence, but you're going to earn it, which meant
Hmm.
talking about stuff they witnessed, testifying in court. So we were making racketeering cases. Like one of them was the sex murder racketeering case. Was
Okay.
53 defendants, about a dozen murders in total. 6 murders committed by one guy who was the head of that organization. He formed it. So I mean, but I got a good taste of seeing what the federal system allows you to do. And look, one of the big things that I think is important, because I don't want to make it sound like we were any better than the detectives I work with, but as a homicide detective, you have 4 days to work a case before you're back in the catching order. So you can catch like another case. Now you got 2 homicides, maybe 3. As a federal agent, you have time
Hmm.
and you have resources. You have money. You have money to pay informants. You have money to do undercover buys. If you have to travel to another state to interview a victim who moved away, you can do that. Where in the state, I didn't have that. And then we had the benefit of a much harsher court system.
Yeah, you
Um,
do.
and yeah, and in New York that worked. But conversely, and I know we're going to talk about Arizona. In Arizona, it had the entire opposite effect, and it was mostly because of the attitude of prosecutors out there. So I mean, it's not something that's across the board throughout the nation. Not every U.S. attorney's office functions the same, and not every court system is the same as what we had in the Bronx. I found Maricopa County, for example, to be outstanding in many ways, and the
Hmm.
sentences in Arizona. If someone was a really bad criminal, and they got convicted because you got to prove your case.
Right.
That the sentences were harsh at
They were
times,
stiff.
unlike the Bronx. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. And the federal court system, there's at least an attempt to make it somewhat similar between Arizona, Florida, New York, and California, with the sentencing guidelines, with uniform laws, and the judges are all supposed to, hang out in the same area as far as sentencing goes. But you do have a big variation in how an office will treat a certain crime from
Yeah.
district to district. And
Yeah.
I'm preaching to the
That's
choir
an
with you.
understatement of the century, my friend.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So, and I'll say a lot of people don't know fully what the ATF does in their mission. One of my favorite movies is Lord of War, and this ATF agent comes up on this gun runner, what's his name, Yuri Orlov, and Yuri tells the guy, let me guess, this isn't about the alcohol and the tobacco. And if folks have bought, especially in Arizona, firearms are everywhere. If you bought a firearm from a dealer, you filled out an ATF form 4473, or maybe they've seen a movie, War Dogs. But could you tell us what the real focus of the organization is? I mean, does it have much to do with tobacco and firearm, or tobacco and alcohol, or is it primarily strictly firearms?
Well, I've seen almost no alcohol enforcement, but we've drank quite a bit of it, actually. Not on duty.
Okay.
Tobacco was somewhat of a bigger thing, although not our primary focus. But I mean, prior to 9/11, we did a lot of tobacco cases. And look, tobacco diversion schemes where you're basically taking tobacco from like a low-cost state and sending it to places like New York, where a
Mm-hmm.
pack of cigarettes can cost like $10, $12, probably more now. Those help fund organized crime and help fund terrorism. Hezbollah, for example, was using tobacco diversion schemes. After Fast and Furious, when a director named B. Todd Jones came in, he realized there was a problem with violence involving firearms, and he focused most of our efforts on gun related crimes.
Okay.
Now, a lot of people think that ATF focuses only on firearms trafficking. That's
Mm-hmm.
that's very, very far from the truth. There'll work cases where someone who shouldn't have a firearm, like a convicted felon or multiple convicted felon, gets caught with a gun. But even that is not like what most agents join to do. They really join to do the kind of stuff that I was talking about earlier, like the sex, money, murder case, where you have gangbangers using guns in continuing criminal enterprises or in drug organizations to go out there and really hurt people.
Mm-hmm.
That's what most agents want to do. There are some who come on and they'll go after just felon in possession cases because it's a quick statistic.
Mm-hmm.
They're easy cases to make. It's almost like ATF's version of a parking ticket. I
Right.
mean, you write it up, you hand it off. And then trafficking cases. Now, candidly, in New York City, we didn't work a lot of trafficking cases because we had two firearms dealers in the entire city.
Okay.
So there wasn't a lot of people going in there doing straw purchases in New
Mm-hmm.
York because you had to have you had to have a permit, which is another thing that makes it hard to straw purchase. Where in Arizona, you don't need a permit and you have
No.
hundreds of firearms dealers. So I mean, we didn't work trafficking cases in some of the big cities. In Phoenix, that was our bread and butter, and it was interesting because that's where I had to really leverage the skills of my agents. I didn't have any experience when I went out there as a supervisor. So I had to watch my agents, and look, I made sure that we were following the laws. I knew the laws, and we
Mm-hmm.
were. But yeah, firearms trafficking is a big part of what they do, but it's not the cases that really most agents really get like they want to sink their teeth into. It's the violent crime cases that most
Okay.
agents are very passionate about.
Well, I know here in Arizona, for example, I mean, they take the straw purchase issue very seriously. And for those that might be listening, a straw purchase is when you actually, maybe I should have you explain it. You're the expert. What is a straw purchase?
Yeah, in essence, it's when you go into a gun shop to purchase a gun. You don't go in there knowing I'm not buying this gun for myself.
Mm-hmm.
I'm buying it for someone else. That person could be a gangbanger, could be a trafficker. That was the big thing in Phoenix was cartel operatives
Mm-hmm.
had little straw purchasing networks that they used. The straw purchaser would buy the gun as soon as they got into the parking lot or maybe down the block. They would hand that gun to the trafficker. So they had no intention of ever using that gun for themselves. Look, it's completely
Right.
different than if you go into a gun shop, right? And you purchase a firearm, whatever, Glock 19, you take it to the range and you realize, I just don't like this gun. And you
Mm-hmm.
decide to sell it to somebody else or even gift it to somebody else. That's not a straw purchase. It's, the intent when you go into that shop is what makes it a straw purchase. And in some parts of the United States, they are investigated and not necessarily prosecuted very aggressively. And in other parts of the United States, sometimes the investigations aren't even that thorough because they're not considered glamorous cases, but they have an impact. They have
Oh,
an impact on
they have a
public
huge
safety.
impact. They have a
Yeah.
huge impact. And that's one thing that I I really picked up out of your book that I hadn't focused on before. You identified source states and buyer states. Could you give an overview as to what the difference is between a source state and a buyer state?
Sure, it's source and market. Like a source state would be where the gun is coming from. So those are states where you have a lot of straw purchasing.
Mm-hmm.
Like for example, in New York City, again, what I was mentioning, there's not a lot of gun dealers in New York City. But criminals want guns,
Mm-hmm.
and it's sad because they give the actual lawful gun owner a bad name because they
Right.
misuse the guns. So, but in New York, because you can't purchase firearms without a permit, and because there's so limited number of firearms dealerships, what happens is you had people from the Bronx, for example, would go down and they would befriend people in South Carolina or Georgia, and they would have them, straw purchase guns for them, and then these
Mm-hmm.
people would smuggle the guns back to New York City, much like what was going on in Mexico with the cartel operatives.
Mm-hmm.
So New York City is the market state, right?
Okay.
So that's where people want to buy the guns, they can't buy them from dealerships. So the value is unbelievable. Now the source state is where they're coming from. So like
Mm-hmm.
if you no BS, a crappy Lawson pistol that you purchased in South Carolina for like $150 would sell on the streets of New York for $1,000.
Wow.
Yeah, so I mean,
Oh, that's a
there's
huge
a market.
markup.
They're driving up the market. Yeah, and so I mean, in Mexico, for example, the same rifle that people were straw purchasing in Phoenix for $600-700 would sell in Mexico for thousands of dollars, and the cartels have incredibly deep pockets, and for them, it's the cost of doing business.
Exactly. Exactly. Okay. So I would imagine that given my understanding of Arizona gun laws and Mexican gun laws and California gun laws, Arizona is at a unique point in the geography of this area that we are considered a pretty open state for firearms sales. We're often given an A rating by the NRA for the lowest amount of regulation. There's no documentation on private party sales. There's constitutional carry. Is Arizona, in your opinion, a pretty open market as far as gun sales go?
Well, Arizona is a source state for California. It's a source state for Mexico. It's a source state for some of the other places where gun purchases are more difficult. Yeah, but I mean, the problem that I have with it is, when you want to talk specifically to Arizona, is we would refer because look, a straw purchase is an act of deception, right?
Right.
Someone's going into a store and they're pretending the gun's for them. Dealers, if the dealers would see something suspicious, they would call us. Invariably, they would call us.
Mm-hmm.
We would interdict the firearms, which was something that was very different from what was happening in Fast and Furious. Obviously, in the cases where that deception is effective, they're not going to know, and then they would find out when the gun would get traced, and then we would conduct those investigations of historical straw purchases. They were always cooperative, but yeah, it certainly drew people to conduct straw purchases in Arizona because it was harder for them to do that in places. And look, in Mexico, I think there's one gun dealer in the entire country. So
Yeah.
obviously, they're not going there and purchasing there. But look, the other fact is the cartels are getting guns from manners other than straw purchasing, burglaries. They're stealing them from Mexican military. They're stealing them from Mexican police. They're taking them after shootings where they're killing Mexican soldiers and cops. They're not leaving those weapons on the ground.
Mm-hmm.
And then you also have smuggling from Central America. You have smuggling from other parts of the world. The cartels they're global conglomerates now.
Right.
But yeah, the issue is people took advantage of the gun laws in Arizona. The bigger problem was when we would identify the people who took advantage of the gun laws or deceived those FFLs, we almost could never get the straw purchaser prosecuted.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's what blew my mind more than anything else about what was happening in Arizona is like we had a handle on things. We knew who some of the more prolific straw purchasers were. And when we would take those cases to the U.S. Attorney's Office of Prosecution, we would almost always be told no. And then the bigger problem is, with straw purchasers, again, they have clean records. So, I mean, some of the state laws don't apply to a person having possession of a firearm because they're not a felon, they're not a domestic abuser, they have clean records, and now they get caught with a gun. So in many instances, in many states, you can't do anything with them unless you can prove they conspired to straw purchase and give that gun to somebody else, which at times is challenging.
It is, and I can say that from the defense standpoint. When we looked at many of the straw purchaser cases, it was I could see how difficult it would be to show the intent of a purchase by a legal possessor of a firearm. And without them actually coming out and saying, yeah, I bought this for XYZ person, or having that other person there to testify, it would be very difficult to prove that beyond a reasonable doubt. So what were the reasons why the prosecutors weren't wanting to take your cases and prosecute them federally? Did they ever come out and directly say why they didn't want to prosecute these straw purchaser cases?
They gave a lot of excuses, and this is what was the most troubling thing to me, because here I am 14 years after leaving Phoenix, after Fast and Furious and all that stuff. Look, we still don't have all the answers as to why Fast and Furious happened, or some of the decisions they would make. But what was troubling to me is, we would stop the straw purchasers most often because we would get a call from the gun dealer. They would say, "Hey, we got a suspicious purchase here. This guy came in with a bag full of money. He's acting strangely." We would wait outside for that transaction to happen, and then we would follow that purchaser, and we would stop the car, and we would ask them questions like cops do all over the country. It was nothing unique. It was nothing groundbreaking. And most often they would say, "Yeah, I didn't purchase it for myself. I purchased it for somebody else." Sometimes they would admit it, at least say that, "Yeah, I know the gun is probably going to go to Mexico." So we would relay that information back to the U.S. Attorney's Office. And sometimes it was, well, we're not interested because they didn't rise to what they believed the level of glamour, perhaps. And then there were other times they would say, "Well, you know what? Yes, we'll take it, and we'll indict it later, let them go." And we would wait for that later to come, and it wouldn't. I mean, we had many cases that actually died on the vine. We had cases, for example, where the statute of limitations expired before they would even make a decision. And the problem that I had with it is, I was aware of the carnage that was happening in Mexico long before Fast and Furious. And I knew that we could have turned off the valve, so to speak, hypothetically speaking. But without that prosecution, we couldn't. So I would watch this body count grow exponentially in Mexico as guns were flooding into the streets, and we would identify straw purchasers, some very prolific straw purchasers, and we would be told, "Hey, we'll indict it later," or not at all. And then there was one case in particular I highlighted in the book where we had a gun that was purchased 2 days later, used in a crime in Cananea, Mexico, where 21 people were killed. 4 of them were cops. 4 other cops were abducted, taken into the desert, beaten and tortured. And we had confessions from the straw purchaser. We actually had a confession from the trafficker. And we were told, "Well, the gun's in Mexico. Body of the crime's in Mexico. We're not going to prosecute it." And then the other thing that blew my mind is, in New York, if let's just say you were a straw purchaser and we pulled you over and you confessed, "Yeah, I bought the gun for Joe. Joe's a trafficker." We would be allowed, we would basically you'd sign a form. It's called and you're a defense investigator, you may have seen these. A waiver of speedy presentment, also called a MAG waiver, which basically you're saying, "Hey, I understand that you're supposed to take me to the magistrate without delay. I'm willing to waive that right now to help myself, and I will deliver the gun to Joe so you can arrest Joe, and maybe I'll get a lighter sentence." We used that extensively in New York. It's been used in California, so it's not a Ninth Circuit thing. Because I used to talk when we proposed using that in Phoenix, I had an assistant U.S. attorney literally tell me, "You can't do that. It's illegal. It's kidnapping. You can't just take someone into custody and have them do something." And I'm like, "We've used this in other parts of the country." They didn't want to hear it. So when you asked me going back, and this is a long way of me saying, I think in many ways the U.S. Attorney's Office in Phoenix was incredibly lazy or just incompetent or a combination of both. And later in my time in Arizona, when I finally saw some cases, because we had this home invasion program that we worked there, when I would watch Phoenix assistant U.S. attorneys perform in the courtroom, because they like to blame the judges. "Oh, it's a Ninth Circuit, the judges." I actually detected, and I spent a lot of time on the witness stand as an agent in New York and as a detective, that the judges were actually frustrated with the clumsiness of the prosecutors in Phoenix in the courtroom. And I think it's because they didn't take things to trial very often.
Mm-hmm.
So, but
Mm-hmm.
the byproduct was guns flooding into the streets of Arizona, guns flooding into the streets of Mexico, and probably guns making their way to other parts of the country. And I know California predominantly, but I
Oh
would
yeah.
imagine other places as well.
Yeah,
So it's easy to
definitely
blame the gun
California.
industry, which some folks want to blame the gun industry. But the reality is a lot of the 90% of the tips that we got came from dealers. So
Right.
to blame them, I think, is disingenuous.
Well, I think so too. And I've been a gun enthusiast all my life, and grew up going to shooting ranges with my dad, and training with the NRA classes and at Cabela's and whatnot. And I found that most, I'd say 98% of those that are involved in the sport of firearms are very respectful of the laws, and they're very protective of their rights that are protected under the Second Amendment. And it's often presented that gun owners are very fast and loose, they're anti-government, they're
Right.
all of these cliches that get thrown against us. But when you get into the reality, it's just factually inaccurate.
Right.
Um,
It's easy to blame things rather than blame
oh,
people or their conduct.
exactly. It's easy to blame a tool other than and forget about the person who picked that up and made a decision.
Right.
Now, I would imagine that as an agent, your challenges would be different from working on a market in a market state like California as opposed to a supply state like Arizona.
Right.
Did you see that in your interactions with various state agencies or states under the ATF's
Yeah.
purview?
Yeah, I mean, look, obviously the NYPD had a massive firearms investigations unit. It's over 600 people. When you consider ATF
Wow.
nationally had roughly like 1,800 agents in the street.
Okay.
I'm not counting headquarters or academy people. So I mean, the issue they had is they're trying to investigate something that trails back to an incident that happened outside of their state. Or even in New York, when I was an agent there, we had a specific group that focused exclusively on trafficking. It was called the Project Lead Group. So the leads would come from when they would trace the gun, it would come back to a dealer somewhere. So they would have to go down, fly out of the state to go
Mm-hmm.
interview that dealer. And again, the dealers down in Georgia, South Carolina, they were helpful. Pull that 4473, look at it, interview people down there, perhaps find the straw purchaser. So you're investigating something that happened outside of your state. Now for the locals, NYPD had the money to do that to some degree, but a lot of police departments don't have the money or the resources to do that, to go
Mm-hmm.
outside of their state, to go interview a straw purchaser, to find out how did the gun get into the hands of this person that used it in a homicide or a school shooting or you name your crime. So it's certainly a lot more like challenging, I think, if you're working in a market state than a source state. Where for us, the dealer would call us, we would sit outside the dealer, watch a transaction happen, because we didn't want to stop the car in the parking lot because there could be legitimate customers in there.
Right.
We also didn't want people who were dealing with cartels to realize that dealers were calling us, because I didn't want somebody to go kill, or threaten a gun dealer, and then they stopped calling us or wound up dead. So we would follow them off, somewhere else, and then say, "Hey, we saw you putting the guns in the trunk of your car. It was suspicious." When the reality was, we were tipped off in advance, and that happened a lot. So I mean, there's certainly different nuances to whether you're working in a market state or a source state.
Now, that brings up a good well, I don't know, it's a good memory, good thought. I know that you all have camped out outside of several gun shows, and in
Yes.
Arizona, there seems to be a gun show every month somewhere. The biggest one I've known of is Crossroads at
Yep.
the Arizona Fairgrounds, and it always
Worked there a lot.
Oh, I know, and it seemed like every time there was the big show, a couple months down the road, or even a month down the road, we'd start getting all of the cases that originated out of your operations at the fairgrounds. And I'll say that there's a bit of a pet peeve of mine, because people always talk about this, what they call the gun show loophole. And I hear, politicians complaining on it, and, saying that they're going to close this loophole somehow, insinuating that there's some sort of like free for all at these gun shows that have little or no regulation. What is your thoughts on what are your thoughts on the regulation of the sales of guns at gun shows? Do you feel that there's an actual loophole, or Is that hyperbolic politician speak?
Well, there is, but there isn't. And here's what I'll say about that. First off, the people who ran the Crossroads of the West gun show were incredibly cooperative with us.
Mm-hmm.
We worked the shows. We would be in there watching the folks who came and went. And look, it was in New York, they did not exist. So the first time I went to one was a real eye opener for me,
Mm-hmm.
because New York City had its look. They demonized the firearm there. Politicians do. I was always a gun enthusiast. I shot. But if you follow the culture, it's completely different than Arizona. So when I went there,
yeah.
first thing I was shocked with is the volume of people who were at the Crossroads of the West Gun Show,
Mm-hmm.
and the fact that the people who ran it were very cooperative with us, which didn't surprise me, because by that time I had dealt with other FFLs, and which is the licensed dealers, as you know. And they were all good people who were business people.
Right.
We dealt with one corrupt dealer my entire time in Phoenix. That was the Excalibur Arms case. But I remember walking around seeing
Oh,
people
yeah.
who
I know that
you had
shop.
like kids eating hot dogs with their parents. For some people, it was like a family outing. And then you would see the occasional person who looked like they just got out of Florence. They had the jail tattoos on them, and they were looking for the people who were selling off paper.
Mm-hmm.
But that wasn't the dealers. So, like, if you listen to Bloomberg and some of those folks, they made it sound like the dealers were there selling guns under the table, when in reality, those dealers would call us saying, "Hey, man, there's a guy over there, and I think he might be selling off paper." And you'd see these people; they'd have signs, "Hey, off, private seller, selling my own firearms." And we would investigate some of them, and they were straw buying guns to sell them. So they were
Mm-hmm.
trafficking guns. And often those cases would also be declined for prosecution by the federal prosecutors. So that was one issue where so blaming the gun industry, I think, is wrong, because these were people who were breaking the law by sneaking into the gun show, and very often not on the floor of the gun show itself. They'd be in the parking lot or
Mm-hmm.
on the perimeter, right? Again, so they're trying to sell to people who can't buy. They're criminals.
And
Prosecute them. Great.
and that's always been my belief, is that this gun show loophole is akin to chasing the abominable snowman. It's somewhat of a made up term that
Yeah.
that insinuates that these shows are just prolific areas for dealers to avoid the background checks that a store might go through. Buying a gun at Cabela's honestly is no different than buying a gun at Crossroads of the West. You still have to fill out the ATF form 4473. That dealer still has to call into the FBI to do a background check on you. You still have to show the same identification. You still have to show your CCW if you've got one. There's really no difference, other than the fact that there might be other gun enthusiasts around, and maybe one of those people will sell you one party to party, which you can do already.
Correct. Yeah, they could do that same transaction down the block at a Circle K. You're entirely correct. But the other thing that used to blow my mind about the Crossroads of the West is, and again, because it's big, it's a big show.
Oh,
we
yeah.
would have people inside, and the dealers, again, going back to the dealers who I know that the left likes to demonize. More often than not, it would be them who, hey, that guy just came over here. He certainly shouldn't be buying a gun. He's looking for one. So we would follow that person,
Mm-hmm.
because the dealers would say, hey, you're not passing NICS. Get out. So we would have that dynamic. And when those people would get caught, more often than not, the U.S. Attorney's Office would say, take it to the county or refuse to prosecute. But we also had instances where we would drive around the perimeter and we would see license plates from as far away as Mexico City.
Wow.
Right, where people would get out of the car and walk in and try to buy guns, and and what blew my mind is, because and I'll admit ignorance. I always looked at the globe as a kid. You don't really understand how far Mexico City is to Phoenix.
Oh yeah.
When you look at, until you one day just really, I traveled to Mexico City. It is like driving from Boston to Miami.
Mm-hmm.
It's a long drive. So here you're thinking, wow, these people try. This is how bad the appetite was for illegal guns in Mexico, that people would drive that far to try to make these transactions. And then if they couldn't buy these guns at the gun show, then what they would do is they would just connect with the straw purchasing networks that were already operating in Phoenix, which, were fueling a lot of the guns making their way to Mexico. So, I mean,
and you bring up an interesting point. It seems like this creation of gun show loophole lingo has actually drawn in criminals to the gun shows that are trying to traffic guns, where had the actual facts of what requirements exist within a gun show were put out there into the media like the gun show loophole verbiage is, perhaps you wouldn't have as many criminals going to the gun shows trying to buy illegal weapons or weapons
Yeah.
that are used for a legal purpose. That kind of brings us to the topic of gun running. And we've been kind of circling around this issue. Could you give us in a kind of an overview of what a gun runner is, in the sense of, someone from the US, someone from Arizona, what is a gun runner doing on a day-to-day basis?
Well, when you look at it from the cartel perspective, or if you look at it from the perspective of like a gangbanger in New York, it's not really much different. Like the New York gangbangers would go down into Georgia,
Mm-hmm.
and it's funny. You go to some of these places that are small towns. People, for some reason, and I don't understand it, were enamored with people from New York. So these guys would go into strip clubs. They would entice women into like I said, getting enamored with them, somehow being impressed with them. And hey, baby, if you go out there and you buy a gun for me, you do me a favor. You get a lot of them were strippers,
Mm-hmm.
and you think what these women do for money is demeaning. To make some extra money, I would think that would be good. So what they would do is they would entice these people to buy guns for them that they would then smuggle back to New York. Usually up I-95, which they call the Iron Pipeline. Again, scary verbiage. Instead of
Mm-hmm.
holding the account, the people that involved in the trafficking accountable, come up with a scary name. In Phoenix, the dynamic was a little bit different. You'd have cartel operatives, and a lot of them were Mexican born that moved to the U.S. Some of them were born in the U.S. Of Mexican nationality. They would look for straw purchasers. And often what they would do is they would look for people that are down on their luck, people who may be a single mom, maybe somebody who's struggling to make the rent. It's like, hey, I can pay you a couple $100. All you got to do is lie on a form. It's just a
Mm-hmm.
box. You check in the box. It says, are you buying the gun for you? You say it's for you, but it's really for me. So these folks are like, okay, it's not a big deal. It's kind of like doing 65 and a 55, right? It's a check mark on the box. So these traffickers, what they would do is they would have these little cells. Buy a gun for me here, buy a gun for me there. They'd send them to Mexico, and then the smart ones, what they would do is, as the guns start getting recovered in Mexico, they cut these straw purchasers loose, and then develop another network. You know what I mean? And have those 5 or 6 straw purchasers buy some more guns for them, and then cut them loose. So it's kind of this cycle. Then you had some who were pretty stupid, and they would just continue to use the same straw purchasers again and again and again. Like there was one straw purchaser in the Fast and Furious case that bought over 800 firearms. So I mean, you look
I
at
know
some of
him.
the
Yeah.
yeah, but I mean, you look at so that's basically how it works. Is the cartels handle these people and have them do some purchases, and they make a ton of money sending these guns south. The other thing that folks don't realize is Mexican aduana, which is the Mexican
Mhm.
version of
Customs.
CBP, customs.
Mhm.
They are unarmed when they're working. They live very close to the border. They are the plaza bosses, the cartel plaza bosses on the Mexican side know who they are because it's Mexico. So, I mean, they are the first line of defense on stopping the guns from crossing the border. They're terrified. And they're not doing their job for the most part because they know that the plaza bosses will come find them after work and perhaps their families. So, I mean, that's the other thing that a lot of folks forget is aduana, in many instances, kind of puts the blinders on
Right.
when guns are making their way into Mexico, which makes it easy for the cartels. The other thing is with these networks is, look, if you're not going to prosecute straw purchasers because you feel bad for them because they're a single mom or because they're having a hard time making ends meet, well, you can't stem that flow. And that's the problem where Arizona kind of became the gun store for the Sinaloa cartel.
Yes, it did.
And it was because the straw purchasers weren't being held to account. The traffickers knew they weren't going to be held to account. And realistically speaking, even when a straw purchaser would be identified, the agents would call the U.S. Attorney's Office, right? Because they couldn't generally take it to the county because you didn't have that conspiracy. You couldn't build that conspiracy.
Mhm.
U.S. Attorney's Office say, hey, we're not interested, send them a cease and desist letter. And some of them would get scared shitless by getting that letter and stop. And others would be like, hey, it's a letter. They're not going to come knock on my door. I'm not worried about it. And they would
Right.
just continue to buy. So you had this weird dynamic where government inaction led to the continuity of sales of firearms to straw purchasers who were smuggling them into Mexico.
Mm-hmm. And you brought up that there was this guy that had over 700-800 guns that he had trafficked. That's I don't want to go into who it is, but I was surprised to find out that this individual that we'd interacted with had turned out to be, at least according to Mexican sources, the most prolific gun runner in documented Mexican history, and that shocked me. Like I I'm just surprised that the sheer quantity of weapons stemmed from this one individual and made it into cartel hands.
Yeah.
So,
Well,
oh, go ahead.
yeah. Well, the other thing about that was like what I spoke about earlier is what my group, because I was in Phoenix Group 1, I was the supervisor there.
Mm-hmm.
We did, like I told you before, the dealers would call us. We would set up outside. We would do the car stop. We would get the confession. We would seize the gun. In fact, ATF had pretty strict rules about how our evidence vaults were handled. Like you had to put your stuff in an evidence vault. Had certain, the walls were reinforced. Had a metal gate, had multiple locks, had an alarm. We were seizing so many guns as a result of the calls from those dealers that we actually wound up getting a Connex box, which quickly filled up with that. Yeah, so we had to get like a variance memo, it's called. We got a second Connex box. So these are storage containers filling up with guns. But those guns were being taken into federal custody.
Mm-hmm.
And we took comfort we were pissed off that no one was going to jail. I'm not going to lie about that. But we took some comfort in, hey, that these guns that we have that were in the hands of criminals, they weren't in the hands of some target shooter, some hunter, some guy who wanted to have a gun in his house for home defense. They were going into the hands of criminals. We took comfort in knowing, hey, at least some Mexican cop or some kid on the U.S. side of the border or some cop on I-10 is going to get killed with these guns. What happened with the other case that you touched on with Fast and Furious, when Phoenix 7 stood up, the dealers called them just like they called us, saying, hey, but rather than stop the cars and rather than seize guns, they just let them ride off into the sunset. And that's what the big difference was. So I want your listener to know that what we did is vastly different than and I'll call them the morons who were running Operation Fast and Furious did.
Right.
It went against the grain of every single thing we believed in.
Well, and that brings up a curious or an issue that I want to discuss. In those cases, it seemed like there was a certain flavor of gun. There's always these AK variants. So yes. These are for those that aren't familiar, these are variations of the AK-47, which is arguably the most prolific gun in history. Started in Russia in 1947, I believe, when it was invented, and then it's been knocked off by Romanians, by Asians, by folks all over the world that have mimicked the same design. There was the Wasser 10. There was this thing called a Draco. There's just various forms, and I always knew when I got a gun case that I'd have 15 or 20 Romanian AK versions. So what was the strategy that this other group, because you were in group 1, that was not the head and the designers of the Fast and Furious strategy? And we'll make that abundantly clear.
Thank you.
Yeah. And what folks don't often understand is this was not an ATF global issue necessarily. There's a lot of good agents out there. There were a lot of great investigative strategies that were implemented. This was a bad one. And so could you educate our listeners as to what the strategy was, as you understand it, to letting the guns walk? And if you could explain what that term means.
Sure. Well, let's go into gun walking first. Like, to walk a gun means one of two. Let's say I'm an undercover agent, and I, in undercover capacity, like you're a whatever, you want a gang member, a biker, whatever, you're a criminal, and you're looking to buy a gun that you can't have because you're prohibited or for whatever reason. And I sell you that gun as in an undercover role, and I let you leave. Like when we conducted those sorts of operations, sting operations, we would usually conduct them in a place where there's no way you're getting away with that gun. Like the second you have hands on that gun, a SWAT team is going to be on top of you, or a bunch of agents. And even if you got away from the SWAT team, there was no way for you to leave that perimeter, like a warehouse area or something like that. So, but to let you leave with that gun would be walking guns, to let you. Second would be, I pull you over and you're a convicted felon or you're narco trafficker or something. You're not supposed to have that gun. And I know you have the gun on you. It's your gun. You brought it there. I have the lawful authority to seize it. And I'm like, I'm going to let you go. Right? We didn't do that. And there's a reason. We don't want you killing somebody. If you kill somebody with a gun that we lawfully should have interdicted, our belief was that we had a hand in that death, right? We had a lawful authority to seize the weapon. an obligation almost. And again, we weren't taking guns from people who were legitimate citizens ever. We just didn't do that. The final one, and this one I never even heard of until Operation Fast and Furious, and this is what Congress asked me the same question: could you define it? A gun dealer, right, calls you and says, "Hey, I got a suspicious transaction," right? And
Mhm.
you say, "Make the sale." And then you let that gun leave. Like I said, we interdicted those guns without fail. When the dealers would, and if we weren't outside, if we couldn't get there, the dealer wouldn't make the sale.
Mhm.
In Fast and Furious, the dealer would call, just like they called us, they would call the agents in Group 7, and those agents would say, "Make the sale." And the dealer would, and the gun would be allowed to leave. Now, the sad part for the dealers is the dealers didn't know ATF wasn't interdicting those guns until much later when those guns started to get traced back from scenes in Mexico. So the dealers were actually calling us and him, and what's up with these new agents? Like, why are my guns getting traced? Because when we seized them, as soon as they left the store, there's no reason to trace them. We
Right.
knew where they came from. So now all of a sudden, these dealers are getting traces, and they felt betrayed, justifiably so.
Mhm.
So that's what walking guns is when you have an obligation under the law to seize it and you don't seize it. And then the final thing is when a dealer's selling a gun because you told them to, that's just as bad as you selling it because
Oh,
they
yeah.
are they're acting at your direction. So they are acting as agents of the government. It's the same
Yeah,
thing as
they're
an informant.
they're
If an informant
co-conspirators
does
at
something,
that point.
correct. Like, and if an informant does something illegal because an agent told him to do it, that's like the agent doing something illegal. So, I mean,
Right.
and that's what happened with Fast and Furious that was so vastly different from anything I've ever seen before or after that horrific mess of a case.
Mhm. So how, as I understand the strategy, the belief was that as you documented these straw purchases of guns, and just for the listeners that didn't see the the surveillance video, we had guys walking out of gun shops with arms full, carrying 6, 8 AK-47s, whatever they could handle in their.
Yes.
It's essentially a shopping cart full of weapons, which is very rare. I've bought a lot of guns in my life. I've never bought more than one at a time. Certainly have not bought 7 of the same one. And
Right.
so the belief was, and correct me on this if I'm wrong, that you could track all of the serial numbers of all of the guns that were illegally purchased and see where they ended up with your Mexican counterparts, with other investigators in other states, and you could that way create a flow, a chart that showed where the guns started and how they got to their destination, and then supposedly investigate and arrest everyone along the way that was involved in this massive conspiracy. Is that fairly accurate?
That is what I was told, but let me clarify this because it's going to piss you off even more than you're
Oh,
pissed off.
well, good.
First off,
I need to be pissed off this morning.
Yeah, no, none of us, because I wasn't in that group, so none of us knew about any of this until after Brian Terry was murdered with one of those guns, which I know is another part of the story. So that's when people started finding, like, what, are you people crazy? So, but that's one thing. The other thing is, and I didn't know this after until I spoke with folks from the Mexico City office. No one from ATF in Mexico was made aware of this. So I don't know how they were going to put the pieces together on the other side, right? So especially without Mexico ATF involvement, and some of them testified in the second Fast and Furious hearing, and so they were pissed off, and they were telling the government of Mexico, "Hey, there's no way ATF's walking guns," and it turned out that they had to walk that stuff back. And one of the guys, the guy who was the head of the ATF Mexico office at the time, is and was a very close personal friend of the Mexican Attorney General.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one thing that was completely mind blowing to us. But the other thing is for those guns to get traced, because Mexico, the country of Mexico, also wasn't a participant in this. You had to, if you were right minded, realize that the only way you were going to put the guns at a destination on the other side of the border was if they were recovered in a search warrant, which Mexico doesn't do a ton of search warrants, or they were recovered at a crime scene, which means that you're willing to let people die at the other end of these rifles to trace. And I'm not saying that that was their intent, but I mean, if you really think things through, if a logical thinker would say, wait a minute, if the only way we're recovering these guns is search warrants, and Mexico doesn't do a lot of law enforcement search warrants on that other side. So the other frequent location where guns were recovered was around bodies. I mean, just it's unconscionable. But the other thing that gets lost, and candidly, Justin, is why I wrote my book, is everybody knows ATF messed up bad here.
Mm-hmm.
But what happened was the U.S. Attorney's Office had an equal vote in not stopping cars. They quarterbacked this case. They quarterbacked another case that involved the grenade trafficker. They threw down obstacles every time somebody wanted to make an arrest. Because I had spoken to the case agent in Fast and Furious. She and I went through the academy together, and I finally was like, Hope, what the
Yeah.
fuck were you thinking? Pardon my language.
Mm-hmm.
And there were times where she's like, Pete, there were times we wanted to stop those cars, and Emery, who's the prosecutor, told us we couldn't. I'm like, well, how? And she'd be like, well, and I know the guy, and it makes sense to me when you know this guy because he's as lazy as the day is long. His thing would be like, well, we know he purchased those 70 firearms before, but how do we prove that he didn't make this purchase for himself? And it just, but again, I'm not giving ATF a pass because that's why you stop cars and you ask questions and you get confessions.
Right.
But it was like the gang that couldn't shoot straight. And it was the same prosecutor that was quarterbacking Operation Fast and Furious, who's declining legions of our cases. And most often, one of the reasons they used was this corpus delicti ruling they had to, hey, once the gun makes its way to Mexico, the body of the crime is in Mexico, we can't prosecute that. Now, all of a sudden, like a flipping a light switch, the strategy becomes send the guns to Mexico. So that was one thing that really got under my skin. And then the other was, this is the same prosecutor who was, again, not prosecuting a guy who we were investigating, who in essence was the armorer to the Sinaloa cartel. He was making grenades for them and taking the AK-47 rifles, because as you described, those Rome arms and those Wassa rifles are semi-automatic rifles. One pull, you pull the trigger, one bullet's going to come out. It's not a machine gun that's going to empty, he was converting those rifles in Mexico to machine guns and confessed to as much. And the U.S. Attorney's Office in Arizona, same prosecutor, refused to prosecute him.
Well, and this brings up an interesting point that I hadn't thought of before now. When you've got, I'm sure you know this, when you've got an investigation that crosses international lines, specifically, let's say between the United States and Mexico, there is a process to go through it's known as the MLAT that involves both the U.S. State Department and the Mexican State Department. And this is an agreement that both countries agreed to, I believe, in 1983, or it was ratified at some point. And it was through The Hague, and the U.S. has these agreements with every country in Central and South America, except for, I believe, Cuba. But to send a U.S. investigation into a foreign country, it is required under international law to involve that government. So how do you know if Emery or anyone at the U.S. Attorney's Office, or I don't remember who the AG was at the time, I can see his face, but were there any conversations to discuss the fact that this case was crossing international lines with anyone in Mexico? I mean, or were they just in complete violation of the MLAT?
Well, with Fast and Furious, they were absolutely in complete violation of the MLAT.
Wow.
The government of Mexico did not know. The Mexico City office of ATF did not know. With the other case, the grenade case, the government of Mexico did know. The Mexican ATF office, again, they're U.S. agents assigned to Mexico City. They knew. In fact, the Mexican Attorney General herself was aware of the grenade case. And here's the other thing that a lot of people don't know. In 2008, we had attended, myself and the special agent in charge of the Phoenix Field Division, a guy named Bill Newell, we had attended this thing in Phoenix. There was the Conference of Western Attorneys General. So what it was every state attorney general west of the Mississippi was there, to include Terry Goddard, the Arizona Attorney General, who was very helpful to me and my agents, by the way.
Oh, good.
And then every attorney general of the state of Mexico was present at this. It was at the Biltmore, the Ritz-Carlton over there in the Biltmore.
Oh, yeah.
And so as a result of what happened at that conference, Mexico assigned a Mexican federal prosecutor, not a Mexican-American federal, like a Mexican government employee federal prosecutor, to the Phoenix office. He sat in an office down the hall from my office, and his job was to facilitate, like if we had information on a Mexican national operating in Mexico, to prosecute that Mexican for his involvement in schemes happening in the U.S. And he was also there to facilitate, like with the Kingery grenade case. Hey, here's the case report. Can you get this to the Mexican Attorney General? Because in case we needed a prosecution on the Mexican side, which we did in the Kingery case. So in Fast and Furious, all they had to do was knock on his door and have a conversation with him and notify Mexico he was there, and that never happened.
Wow.
I mean, so that's just, to me, it's unconscionable. But like, was Eric Holder ever held accountable?
Eric
No.
Holder, that's the name I was trying to think of. Yeah.
Was Emery Hurley the lead prosecutor, or his predecessor, Rachel Hernandez, who's now, by the way, the number 2 at the Phoenix U.S. Attorney's Office? Was she ever held accountable for? No. Agents, there were people in ATF that were fired. There were others who were demoted. But in the U.S. Attorney's Office, no one was held to account. There was one scapegoat in Maine Justice who was actually a very good prosecutor back in the day, a guy named Jason Weinstein, who somewhere in the chain of commands, in the line all the way up to Holder, I guess didn't voice opposition enough. But other than that, on the lawyer side of the house, no one was touched.
No one.
Well, excuse me, Dennis Burke, the U.S. Attorney for Arizona, was forced to resign. And I was told it was more because of the Kingery grenade case than it was because of Fast and Furious, because he signed off on an operation where we were going to let the Mexicans try to do an interdiction of Kingery when he was crossing the border. And the interdiction failed. And this was after Fast and Furious that Kingery became known. So, but that was strike 2 for Burke. And my understanding is he was kind of told, hey, you should resign or you're going to get canned. And he resigned to get out in front of it.
Yeah. I mean, you all, while no agents or very few agents really took much of a hit over this, there was a social aspect to it. I know I remember going down to the Mexican border with Hope, with a couple of agents from the FBI and I believe the DEA to conduct some interviews. And the DEA agent, during this interview, made a snide comment to our witness and said, if we see cocaine that's coming south or coming north, we have to stop it. He said, we can't let cocaine walk. And the FBI agent was shaking his head and put his hand in his head in his hand, because Hope was just taking heat from this DEA agent during a witness interview. And I imagine that the shade that ATF agents got around the country was pretty bad from their federal counterparts after that incident occurred.
Oh, no, I'll go one step further. Like, I was in Phoenix Group 1. We did not know that they were letting guns walk until after Brian Terry's death. And then an agent named John Dodson came forward and blew the whistle, if you remember.
I do.
And then what happened was, at a subsequent meeting, because we used to have these management meetings every Monday. So, and I would hear the numbers go up, and it was kind of insulting in hindsight, because when I would ask, hey, wait, like 600 guns, are you guys interviewing a straw purchaser? Like, oh, Pete, we're doing something different. And I'm not arrogant enough to think I know everything. So I'm like, okay. So first I don't say anything. Then the numbers are going up. I'm like, well, what are they doing that's different? If it's something groundbreaking, it'd be nice to know.
We're on the same team.
Right. So then it's still, hey, mind your business, kind of was the attitude I got from this guy named George Gillette. I'll name him. He was the person under the special agent in charge, sinister guy, knew what was happening there and turned a blind eye to it. And so, I mean, as the numbers would go up, it would just get more and more and more appalling. And it wasn't until after Brian's death that at one of those meetings, the exact words were something like this. Again, I didn't know John Dodson. I had never met John Dodson. Hey, U.S. Attorney's Office is really pissed off at John Dodson for contacting Grassley's office. I'd steer clear of him if I were you. And this is talking to managers now, mind you. It's not just regular field agents either. Don't be surprised if John Dodson finds himself indicted. And I'm sitting to myself saying, wait a minute, all of these straw purchasers, all of these traffickers that we had confessions from, we're still investigating Kingery, who we had confessions from. They won't indict them, but they're going to indict John Dodson. That's what actually led me to contact Grassley's office myself, because I was like, this is a bridge too far for me. Like, I can't sit here and watch them indict. And I didn't know John himself actually walked 6 guns. I didn't know that at the time. But my thoughts were they were going to blow, like maybe he gave up some sensitive information in blowing the whistle, and that's why they're going to indict him. So that's why I contacted Grassley's office. But the thing is, if you talk to ATF agents from around the country, all of us in Phoenix were a cancer. Like, how dare you? You guys walk guns. And I'm like,
right.
I didn't walk shit. We tried. We seized thousands of guns. No one went to jail. And then if you talk to agents from other organizations, especially the Border Patrol, ATF
Oh,
in
yeah.
mass walked guns, and I don't blame them. They had a dead agent. And look, I've been in touch with Brian Terry's family since writing the book. I wanted them to read the book before the public read it because I thought they
Hmm.
deserved that. But they, I can't imagine what goes through their minds, when they think about ATF. And the reality is that they've never received the answers that they deserve. I mean, Brian Terry, by all accounts, was a hero, former Marine,
Right.
Border Patrol, not for very long either. A lot of people don't know. He was only with the Border Patrol for, I think, about 3 years and
Hmm.
still managed to get onto BORTAC, which is their like most elite team. And I would argue probably the most elite tactical team in U.S. law enforcement,
Oh,
more
wow.
so than FBI, HRT, in my opinion.
Hmm.
So this guy, I mean, for all his sacrifices and for what he accomplished in his short career, he's a hero.
Right.
And that his family was treated with such disrespect and just disregarded by the Department of Justice is something that really boils my blood to this day, Frank.
Hmm. Wow. Wow. It really is. I, you brought up John Dodson. I remember this must have been, well, it was right after, I don't remember the actual the year that it happened, but it was right after it came out that John had called Grassley's office and it had leaked to the media and the report started popping up in Phoenix. Hey, the ATF is up to something shady with the cartels. This attorney called me to their office and went over there, and I'd been working the Fast and Furious case for a while, and walked in. There's a guy sitting at the conference room table, and said, "I want to introduce you to Agent Dodson from the ATF." So, we sat down and talked. Seemed like a fantastic guy, but he seemed to be under attack from his own agency, and
Yeah.
I felt in that moment that we were hiding out an individual from the government that he was hired to represent, and from other law enforcement officers that he worked alongside. And it was very shocking to me that these agents, John and yourself, you had to come out and push back on an agency like the ATF. What was it that, I mean, what has given you the most kind of comfort over the last several years, since this broke, since you and John went forward? You've both been before Congress, you've both been interviewed, I don't know, probably hundreds of times. And what has the outcome been for you as far as how you see the ATF, how you see the response to the information that you and John provided?
Well, look, initially they did go after John. And like I said, I mean, even the special agent in charge of Phoenix, who was my boss my entire time there, who saw all these cases the U.S. Attorney's Office wouldn't prosecute, how he, as the leader, could think that it was okay for them to prosecute or talk about prosecuting John for anything at that point was unconscionable. But I mean, there's something that I think is important, and I reference it in the book I wrote. Um, when I blew the whistle, right, John had already stepped forward. They were going to clean John's clock. I got subpoenaed. And when I
Mm-hmm.
got subpoenaed, by that time, the entire command staff at Phoenix had been removed, justifiably so, I would say. And a new special agent in charge, which is the highest ranking guy in the field division, came in. His name is Thomas Brandon, former Marine. He later went on to become the acting director of ATF, but at this point, he's just a new special agent in charge. So I told him, like his day one showing up, which was actually before I got subpoenaed. So let me go back a little bit. He asked me to brief him on what's happening in your group, and I was group one, and it was supposed to be like a 1 hour meeting, turned into almost a full day meeting. Like he literally canceled his meeting for the rest of the day. I was the first one to go in. I laid everything on the table, all the cases I spoke about that were declined, the Kingery grenade case, how that case was languishing, how they weren't prosecuting that, how we tried to get Mexico to everything. So and then a couple of weeks later, I wound up getting a subpoena, so I had to notify him. That's what you do. You have to notify your chain of command. Then I got a letter saying, you are not to talk to Congress, which
Mm-hmm.
pound sand. But when I handed Tom Brandon that letter, he reached into his pocket and he pulled out a challenge coin. He's a very religious man, and he's former Marine, polished guy, and it was a St. Michael challenge coin. And he said, Pete, look, he said, what you're doing here, if you're going to talk to Congress, it's a big deal. He goes, they're going to throw fastballs at you. You need to hit him out of the park. He said, take this. He says, I hope it gives you some strength. He said, run to the truth. And as long as you're telling the truth, I have your back.
Mm-hmm.
Um, want to talk about leadership? He had my back. Now, look, after I testified in the deposition, because the deposition came before the hearing. Deposition was like 6 hours roughly. Everything I said in that deposition was relayed back to DOJ and to the U.S. Attorney. So I became like a marked man in Phoenix. And Tom, he couldn't really fight for me. And I want this to be clear, because he wasn't in Phoenix. Like, he didn't have the evidence, but
Hmm.
he knew that I had the evidence. And unlike a lot of managers in federal government, Tom gave me the space to fight for myself and didn't come looking to club me over the head for doing it. And there were a
Hmm.
couple times where I'd have to do things, and he's like, "Hey, man, take the day off so that you're not doing this on job time, so that they can't come after you for misusing DOJ time." Like, he gave me advice, and there were times where things got caught up in the media, because you're not supposed to talk to the media. There's times I did, because I wanted the public to know, "Hey, man, I'm a marked man. I
Right.
might need your sympathy. Here's what's really going on." And so I mean, he gave me the space to do that. And then Eric Holder appointed an actual director who got confirmed by the Senate, a guy named B. Todd Jones. And I said, "Oh shit, I'm doomed,"
Hmm.
because he was friends with Holder, and he turned out, former Marine, to be very much like Tom. Like, "Hey,
Hmm.
man, as long as you're telling the truth, we're good." And I think that's how I survived. But for a long time, like when I walked around like ATF headquarters or something, you would think I had like a radiation symbol around my neck,
Right.
like, "Stay away." And then it was when people realized like I wasn't calling out all of ATF.
Hmm.
I wasn't demonizing the organization. I'm saying, here's a problem. And if we can't talk about this problem, we can't fix that problem. And by the way, those prosecutors have bloodier hands than some of the people that are like getting dragged through the mud in the media. When they realized I was being fair, then I was kind of slowly welcomed back into the fold.
Okay.
But for a
Okay.
while, man, it was rough. And look, there was a period where I was under surveillance, and I don't know if it was FBI, DOJ, OIG, ATF, like internal affairs, trying to see if I was leaking information.
Hmm.
That was, and sometimes under surveillance means when you're out to dinner with your family and stuff. So I
Right.
mean, that was pretty unnerving. But
I can
I just,
imagine.
yeah, I just tried to just do what I promised the taxpayers I would do, is do my job. And I felt in this instance that telling the truth was part of my job.
Hmm. Hmm. Now, just to touch on this, on the Kingery case, you've mentioned his name a couple of times, and I noticed the grenades on the cover of your book.
Yeah.
Could you tell us when you first made contact with Kingery, or when he was first identified as someone who was moving weapons into the hands of the Mexican cartels?
Well, King, he first came onto our radar in a weird way, like a dealer, and I don't know if it was in Prescott or Flagstaff, a dealer of like Army Navy supplies. Wasn't even a gun dealer. Like, he
Hmm.
sold Army Navy stuff. Like, you can go buy sleeping bags and a tent, and you can go buy an inert hand grenade, which is it's a paperweight. It's useless.
Right.
You could buy them in gun. You can even buy them in New York City, right? You can't buy a
Hmm.
gun. So this guy calls us. Hey, this guy came in and bought a bunch of inert hand grenades. I don't know if it's anything. So, and he called one of my agents in Yuma, because Kingery lived in Yuma, and the agent tells me about it. I'm like, okay, that's odd, but it's not illegal. That they're not contraband anywhere in the United States. So okay, um, but he was on their radar in Yuma for a straw purchase that happened a couple years earlier that was declined for prosecution because the guns went to Mexico. So then they start looking at Kingery, and they determine that he's getting grenade parts now, different parts, not the inert whole grenade, from different parts of the United States. So we start to look at them, and then two things happen. One is grenades are starting to get recovered in Mexico, and we interdicted a shipment of grenade parts, just the hulls, not like the top, just it's like the thing that looks like a pineapple.
Hmm.
And a decision was made by Bill Newell, like, hey, let's mark them in such a way that if they get recovered, we can. And I can't get too much into the
Right.
weeds on the marking because it's
Right.
sensitive information, but it be marked in such a way that if they get recovered somewhere, then we'll be able to say that they are coming from Kingery. So my thoughts at the time were, all right, look, we don't know what he's making. He could be making like ornaments. He could be making IEDs and selling them in Yuma. He could be making IEDs and selling them in Mexico. I'm like, if he's making ornaments, we're never going to recover one anyway. It's not going to matter. But if they're turning up somewhere, at least we'll have a starting point. So it's kind of like a Hail Mary toss, if
Hmm.
you will. So they marked them. None ever get recovered. But as we continue to look at Kingery, they start to talk to members of his family, and they talk to his kids. They talk to his wife. We find out that he had some weird ties to the police in Mazatlan, And we find out that he had left his wife in Yuma and was married to the chief of police's daughter in Mazatlan. And then, we were able to get a look at where he lived in Mazatlan, which was beautiful house. I was like, all right, this guy's up to something. So then at some point he gets caught crossing the border, because we were talking to CBP, we were talking to Mexico. Like I said earlier, we were sharing information with that prosecutor in Mexico. Carlos Canino, who was the ATF attaché in Mexico, was speaking directly with the Mexican Attorney General and with the U.S. acting ambassador, a guy named John Feely. So everybody, unlike Fast and Furious, people were talking to each other. So Kingery gets caught crossing at the San Luis port of entry with 114 disassembled grenades in his tire. No explosives, just the grenade parts.
In his tires?
He was making in his tires, yeah. So what happened was, because the Border Patrol knew we were looking at him, they run his car through an X-ray machine, which they're allowed to do, and they see all of these disassembled grenades in his tires. So they don't know if they're disassembled or not. They just see the grenade hole. So they shut down the port. As you can imagine, a bomb squad now has to come and make sure that there are no live explosives. So this is a big deal to close an international port of entry.
Oh, yeah.
And it also, as you know, the plaza bosses on the other side are watching this happen. So Kingery comes in, confesses to making grenades for people. So the U.S. Attorney's Office that evening says, "Oh, you know what? Let him go home. I want a better interview." So here we're letting a guy who could be a bomb maker, we believe he was a bomb maker, go home for the night. Anyway, lo and behold, he does show up the following day. And again, he's caught with 114 or so in his tires through an X-ray machine. So it wasn't like he could say, "Well, I didn't know they were there." It wasn't a rented car; it's his car. So he comes in, and after a lengthy questioning, he's like, "Yeah, I've been making hand grenades for the Sinaloa cartel." He estimates about 800. He says that he was taking the AR-15 variants. As you know, that wasn't their primary weapon of choice. They like the AK better, but they took those when they could get them. They took Barretts when they could get them. And he was converting them into fully automatic machine guns in Mexico. And he confessed that he was doing that same thing with both AR and AKs. So we relay this information back to Emery Hurley, the assigned prosecutor, and he's like, I don't like the confession. He can always say it was coerced. And this is his exact words, and it boils my blood. Pete, at trial, him and his lawyer can say he's making those hilarious complaint department take a number grenades, those novelty desktop items.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm just sitting there like, I can't believe this. So and it was so bad that I actually called the U.S. Attorney's Office in New York, who was working a case on the Sinaloa cartel at the time, figuring, hey, is there any way that you can integrate this into your larger conspiracy? And they were like, well, are there any money transfers through banks in the Southern District? No, there weren't that we knew of at that time. And it turned out later on there weren't. Did he order any parts from our district? And he didn't. There were parts he ordered from Old Sarge's, which is up in Western New York, not in the Southern District. So, here we had a district 2,000 plus miles away was willing to charge Kingery if we could have found that little thread going through their district.
Linked it back in.
Right. So anyway, I call Emery back, and I'm like, Emery, I can't let this guy go. He's like, no, we need more. He goes, I'm telling you to he goes, maybe we can indict it in the future. So we bring Kingery in for the first time in my career. And in the homicide squad, right, you make or break cases in the interview room. So I've done a lot of interviews at this point. So we bring Kingery back in again. And now it's my agents. It's an ICE. Back then, Homeland Security Investigations was still ICE. Now they've kind of bifurcated. And so they had an ICE attorney in there too. And so Kingery's like, yep, tells us the same things again. And is there anything you forgot? Oh, yeah, thumb drives. So he confesses that he takes thumb drives from Mexico into the U.S. And we're like, well, what's in the thumb drives? Well, sometimes somebody might owe money or somebody has to get taken care of. What do you mean taken care of? Well, kidnapped, killed. So I'm like, all right, call Emery back. Emery, tell him about the thumb drives. Right? So it's potentially people may have been kidnapped or killed as a result of what Kingery brought north into. Don't like it. Let him go. We'll meet in 2 weeks and we can revisit this. Maybe we'll indict it. So 2 weeks comes. We actually have the meeting. He would not budge. It wasn't until well over a year later, after Fast and Furious happened, when Emery was removed from all of his cases, that the case was reassigned to a prosecutor named Josh Parecki, who within like 30 days was ready to indict the case. Josh was phenomenal. But I'm like, Emery had the case for almost 2 years and nothing happened. So, which makes you wonder, like, what the hell was going on with Emery Hurley that he dragged his ass on Fast and Furious, wouldn't touch Kingery? It just, again, it's an answer that to this day I don't know.
Yeah, and I'm curious about it as well. And maybe we could have a follow-up meeting with Kingery's attorney, who's a who's a good friend of mine. Um, I'll tell you, when I started going through your book, I got to the point where you first mentioned Kingery, and I paused. I thought, God, what the hell does Kingery have to do with Fast and Furious? I know that name, so I went into my email and found, you know, communications about him, and realized that was 2013 when he was indicted. I got
Yes.
called on it to talk about it to someone in 2016, but
Oh,
it sounds like you had eyes on him. What, in
2010.
2010? So
Yeah.
so he was on the streets for 3 years with the full knowledge that he was under at least suspected of arming the Sinaloa drug cartel, and it was at least another 3 years after that that the case actually was moving. So this guy
Well,
was
because
on.
what happened was we actually led the Mexican authorities to his grenade mill in Culiacan,
Hmm.
and they hit his grenade mill. And originally the Mexicans charged him in Mexico, and it wasn't until 2013 or so that the U.S. finally extradited him to face charges for violating the Arms Export Control Act. So originally the government of Mexico did charge him, and this was before I was taken out of Arizona, and I left Arizona in 2012. So I think it might have been the summer of 2012
Okay.
where Kingery was arrested by the PGR, Mexican
Hmm.
federal prosecutors.
Right.
And it was the ATF Mexico City office that actually guided them to his door. So, but he was charged in Mexico for a short time before he was extradited up. And they
Okay.
actually charged him with terrorism,
Wow.
which I was shocked, frankly, that he was even extradited because he was looking at a lot of time in Mexico. And then my understanding is, and again, I was removed from Arizona, so I wasn't involved in the case at that point. But my understanding is he was out of prison by 2016 or 2017 here in the United States, which led to people asking me a million questions. Was he an informant for somebody? I don't know.
Right.
And maybe that's why it took so long to indict him. But I mean, if that were the case, I would think why not tell us so we wouldn't waste our time investigating him
It
if
would
he
be
was.
nice to know. And I guess us on the outside that work around the federal agencies, we got a lot of cases with ATF, FBI, DEA, and it's it's always shocking to me when I can see that one agency isn't talking to another, or often even one agent isn't talking to another, or one
Yeah.
ASAC isn't talking to another.
Well,
You've
look,
got a breakdown in communication there, and things fall through the cracks.
you have a unique perspective on this because you did this sort of work as a defense investigator, so you understand this world. I think your listeners would be shocked to know how common it is for federal agencies to not talk to one another, for federal agencies to backstab each other. And it's not just an Arizona thing. And this is something that
Hmm.
happens all over the country. Look, some parts of the country the agencies work very well together. In other parts, they don't. We had great relationships with HSI.
Hmm.
Back then it was ICE. Um, you know, in Yuma not so much, but in Phoenix, I had great relationship with the U.S. Marshals. Our relationship with the FBI was somewhat strained. In Florida, when I was down there as the agent in charge of the Miami office, we got along with everybody. In New
Hmm.
York, so I mean, it's not what the taxpayer expects, where they would want law enforcement to work well together, to share intelligence. It's now that I'm retired and I can speak freely about it, it's actually like um, kind of bad when you
Right.
think about how territorial the organizations get and how they let
Hmm.
organizational pride get in the way of keeping the taxpayer safe.
Right. It's true. It's true. And hopefully we can overcome that. And with some new leadership in some of these agencies, we can take egos out of the mix. Because
Be
if you
nice.
if you've got investigators with egos, that what ends up suffering, in my opinion, is the victims, is their investigation. You've got cases that go to crap, like several of yours that you saw, because there was no coordination, there was no leadership, there was no common goal amongst the various players of the federal government that are all supposed to be working together.
Right.
So,
Right.
Peter, I want to bring you back on because I'd like to get more into Kingery and some more of the issues that had occurred here in Phoenix. It'd be great if we can get Dodson and Kingery's attorneys on and have an open discussion. I'll reach out to them and see if they're up for it.
All right.
Could you, I want to make sure that everyone knows about your book, and I really like everyone that's listening to look into it and read it. And could you give us an overview of why you wrote the book and what you hope the people get out of it before we go?
Absolutely. I wrote the book because when I was towards the end of my career at ATF, I was a head of training.
Mm-hmm.
And we had a presentation that they did at the academy about Waco. What went wrong, what happened, because mistakes were made, right? And ATF eventually owned them. So the hope was so that it'll never happen again. I suggested, why don't we put together something on Fast and Furious so that we can teach our agents what happened? Because I'd have agents come up to me from other parts of the country, and I would tell them the stuff that we discussed, and they'd be like, oh, we didn't know that. So I was like, you don't know history, you're bound to repeat history. So that was one reason why I wanted to put together this training. I was always told, nope, we don't talk about Fast and Furious.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of like Fight Club. We don't talk about Fight Club. And I found that infuriating, especially because other agents that approached me from other parts of the country, if they didn't know, the general public certainly didn't know, and our partners from other agencies didn't know. So that was one reason. And then, truthfully, the other reason was, like I mentioned before, Brian Terry's family was never given the answers. And when I finally did reach out to them, like when I sent them copies of the book, I let them know, look, I don't have all of the answers. I wasn't in that
Mm-hmm.
group. I didn't see what was happening in that group, but I want you to have some of the answers. And I hope in the end that they will get the answers to these. Or DOJ treated them abysmally. And the other thing is Brian Terry's mom, Josephine Terry, just had open heart surgery recently.
Mm-hmm.
I think she might be getting released yesterday or today from the hospital. I mean, this woman's a wonderful woman. She's been through all kinds of things since then, as have Brian's brother and two sisters. So, I mean, if your listeners could keep them in their prayers. And like I said, if we keep banging the drum and finally all of the truth comes out, I think the taxpayers deserve it, but I certainly think Brian's family deserves it. And I think that, again, with the book and maybe other things that come up, maybe this will never happen again, and we'd all be better off for that.
Exactly. Yeah, I'm a huge supporter of government transparency, of openness, and honesty in dealing with our government agencies, because we as citizens, we pay for it. We expect to be able to hold our government agencies to account when there is a mistake, and maintain this quality of life that we've got here in the U.S. So I want to thank you, Peter, for coming on today. I want to thank you for your years of service. We're just a couple of days past 9/11. There's so much to talk about with your 9/11 experience. You've just had an amazing career of serving the public, and I hope you feel the appreciation from the citizens, and especially from me and my office. So thank you for coming on.
Justin, I'm honored to be here, and I'm honored to have served. And if you ever want to get back together and chat on some of these other things, or just reach out, man, I'll be happy to come back on.
That'd be great. I appreciate it, Peter.
Take care. Stay safe.
You too.
Thanks for tuning in to Truth Be Found. Keep the pursuit alive and subscribe to the realm of high-profile investigations as each secret edges us closer to the truth. Until next time, stay vigilant.